November 20th, 1943, 09:14 hours, Cape Torquina, Bougainville Island. First Lieutenant Daniel R. Mercer was 26 years old, crouched behind a rotting palm stump, staring through drifting cordite smoke at a Japanese bunker dug into a coral ridge 180 yards ahead of him. The bunker had stopped the advance for nearly an hour. Mercer was the executive officer of Battery C, 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines. He was not supposed to be this far forward. His job, according to the book, was coordination, fire missions, maps, radios, not direct fire, not crawling through mud with an artillery sight pressed against his cheek. But at 09:14, the book no longer mattered. At 09:07, the 1st Marine Platoon had tried to rush the ridge. 2 men were hit within seconds. A third never stood up again. The Japanese position, reinforced logs, packed coral, firing slits no wider than a man's hand, had survived naval gunfire, mortars, and a strafing run from a pair of SBD Dauntless dive bombers an hour earlier. Now it was Mercer's problem. Behind him, half hidden under camouflage netting and palm fronds, sat the weapon the infantry officers had mocked since landing. The M1A1 75mm pack howitzer. The men called it the Toy. It weighed 1,270 pounds fully assembled, less than a third of a standard 105mm howitzer. Its barrel was short, just over 4 feet. Its effective range was 8,800 yards on paper, but that number meant nothing here, in jungle broken into 30-yard slices by vines, ravines, and coral spines. What mattered was that the gun could be broken into 6 loads. What mattered was that mules, or Marines, could carry it where nothing else could go. What mattered was that Mercer had dragged it here by hand. At 09:41, he made the call. "Direct fire," he told the gun chief. The order was met with silence. Direct fire artillery was not doctrine, not officially. Artillery stayed behind the lines. It fired over maps and calculations. You didn't point a howitzer at something you could see with your own eyes, unless you had no other choice. By 09:58, the crew had manhandled the gun into position, its split trails dug into the coral with entrenching tools. The elevation was dropped to near zero. The shield, thin steel, never meant to stop more than fragments, was angled directly toward the ridge. At 09:02, Japanese rifle fire began snapping through the leaves overhead. 09:14. He lay prone beside the gunner, Corporal Frank Ionescu, a Romanian immigrant from Ohio who had learned his gunnery tables faster than anyone in the battery. "Range?" Ionescu asked. 180, left bunker, firing slit at 2 o'clock. The bunker was barely visible, a dark rectangle cut into the ridge, half hidden by ferns. Muzzle flashes flickered inside it. At 09:15, Mercer raised his hand. "Load HE." The round weighed just under 15 pounds, high explosive, point detonating fuse. The loader slid it into the breech. The block slammed shut. The infantry platoon ahead of them hugged the earth. They were less than 70 yards from the target. At 09:16, Mercer hesitated. He had seen the reports. He knew the math. A 75mm shell was not supposed to kill a bunker like this. The Japanese had learned in China and the Solomons. They built deep. They built angled. They built to survive. This was not a 155. It was not even a 105. It was a pack gun. He lowered his hand. Fire. The gun recoiled violently, slamming backward against the trails. The blast flattened the grass around it. The shell struck low, exploding against the coral face just beneath the firing slit. Dust and white smoke billowed out. At 09:16 and 30 seconds, Japanese fire stopped for 3 seconds. Then it resumed. Adjust. Up 2 mils. The second round hit closer, fragments slicing through the palm leaves overhead. At 09:17, the third round punched directly into the slit. The explosion was contained, then forced outward. A slab of timber blew free and tumbled down the ridge. No fire came back. The infantry did not move. They had seen this before. At 09:18, Mercer shifted his attention right. "There's another one! 200 yards! Logs stacked vertical!" Mercer crawled forward, binoculars pressed to his face. He saw it. Bunker 2 sat higher, angled to enfilade the beach approach. It had survived everything thrown at it since dawn. At 09:19, Japanese machine gun fire resumed from that position, raking the tree line. Mercer looked back at the gun. The crew was sweating. The loader's hands shook as he reached for the next round. "How many HE left?" 32, the chief replied. Mercer nodded once. "Traverse right. Same drill." At 09:20, the first shell hit short. At 09:21, the second struck the logs, chipping wood and doing nothing else. At 09:22, the third hit the base. Mercer remembered the technical manual then. He remembered reading that the Japanese often built bunkers with air gaps beneath the firing chamber, spaces meant to absorb shock. He also remembered that blast liked confined spaces. "So," he said, "lower, skip it." The fourth round ricocheted off the coral lip and vanished beneath the logs. The explosion lifted the bunker. Not figuratively, physically. The logs jumped, the firing slit collapsed inward. At 09:23, there was screaming. At 09:24, it stopped. 2 bunkers down. The infantry began to move, cautiously now, rifles up, grenades ready. At 09:25, a new threat announced itself. A 47mm anti-tank gun opened fire from deeper in the ridge, its first round tearing through a tree 10 yards behind the howitzer. Splinters ripped into the shield. The Japanese had found them. Mercer flattened himself against the ground. The gun could not duel that weapon. One hit would kill everyone behind the shield. At 09:26, Mercer made a decision he would later replay in his mind for years. He chose to stay. Third bunker, same ridge, 50 yards past the first. The crew stared at him. "That gun's for tanks," the chief said. "So are we." At 09:27, they fired again. The howitzer barked. The shell screamed downrange. The third bunker had been overlooked. It was smaller, better concealed, and closer, just under 150 yards. At 09:28, the first round blew away foliage. At 09:29, the second cracked a log face. At 09:30, the third went inside. The explosion vented through the rear exit. Smoke poured from the ridge. The anti-tank gun fired again. This time, the round struck 10 yards short, showering the position with coral fragments. At 09:31, Mercer counted silently. They had fired 21 rounds in 10 minutes. 3 bunkers were silent. At 09:32, the infantry surged forward. At 09:34, the ridge was taken. Mercer finally exhaled. He did not cheer. He did not speak. He looked at the gun. It was still there, mud-spattered, scarred, intact. The toy had done its job. By noon, word of the engagement was moving up the beach. By nightfall, it would reach division. And by the end of the campaign, it would change how Marines thought about artillery in the jungle.
By 10-12 hours, the ridge at Cape Tarokina was officially reported secure. The report that moved up the chain was brief. It listed 3 destroyed enemy bunkers, 1 neutralized anti-tank gun, and 12 Japanese dead confirmed. It noted light Marine casualties for the final assault. It did not mention how those bunkers had been destroyed, or from how far away. That omission would not last. At 10:47, a major from regimental headquarters arrived on foot, helmet still wet from the surf. He walked straight past the infantryman collecting equipment and stopped in front of the gun. "This is what did it?" he asked. Mercer nodded. The major squatted, ran a hand along the barrel, and frowned. That thing? He had expected something larger, a 105, maybe naval gunfire coordination, something heavy enough to justify what he had seen on the ridge. Instead was the M1A1 pack howitzer, short-barreled, squat, with thin trails and a shield no thicker than a mess tray. 21 rounds, Mercer said, direct fire. The major said nothing for several seconds. At 11:03, the first formal after-action message was transmitted to division artillery. It contained a single line that would be repeated, rephrased, and argued over for the next year of fighting in the Pacific. Light artillery employed in direct fire proved decisive against reinforced enemy field works at close range. The battle for Bougainville had begun weeks earlier, on November 1st, 1943. The landing at Empress Augusta Bay was designed to establish an airfield, not to seize the entire island. Intelligence estimated 40,000 Japanese troops on Bougainville. The Marines had no intention of fighting all of them, but the Japanese did not cooperate. By November 20th, Marine patrols probing inland had encountered a defensive belt built with the lessons of Guadalcanal and New Georgia fully absorbed. The bunkers were low, interlocking, and nearly invisible. Many were dug into reverse slopes, immune to naval gunfire. Mortars could suppress them, flamethrowers could kill them, but only if infantry could get close enough. Too often they could not. The problem was weight. A standard 105 mm howitzer weighed more than 4,900 pounds. It required prepared positions, cleared fields of fire, and hours of work. In a jungle, it might as well have been anchored to the beach. The M1A1 pack howitzer was different. Designed in the 1920s and adopted in 1934, it had been built with a single purpose in mind: movement. The barrel alone weighed 120 pounds. The entire gun could be broken down into loads that a mule or 6 Marines could carry. It had been intended for mountain warfare, not island jungles. By 1943, it was considered obsolete by many artillery officers. Its shell was small. Its range was limited. Against concrete, it was thought to be inadequate. But Bougainville was not concrete. It was logs, coral, earth, angles, gaps, and at distances measured in yards, not miles. At 13:26 on November 20th, Mercer was summoned to battalion headquarters. He arrived muddy, exhausted, and still smelling of powder. The battalion commander listened as Mercer described the engagement minute by minute. He asked about ranges, about angles, about ammunition expenditure. He asked one question twice. "How close were you?" 150 to 200 yards, Mercer said. The major leaned back. "That's rifle distance." "Yes, sir." At 14:02, the commander issued an informal directive. Pack howitzers were to be prepared for direct fire employment when terrain or enemy fortifications made indirect fire ineffective. It was not doctrine, not yet, but it was permission. Over the next 10 days, Battery C repeated the process 6 more times. On November 24th, at 8:11, a single gun knocked out a bunker complex that had stalled an entire company for half a day. On November 27th, at 1644, another pack howitzer was dragged into a coconut grove and used to fire point blank into a cave entrance at 90 yards. Each time, infantry officers watched skeptically. Each time, they asked for it again the next day. The Japanese adapted quickly. By early December, they began targeting the guns the moment they revealed themselves. Snipers learned to look for the thin shield. Mortar crews zeroed in on muzzle flashes. One pack howitzer crew was wiped out on December 3rd when a 90mm mortar crown landed directly behind the breech. Mercer attended the burial that afternoon. He stood in the rain and listened to the chaplain speak. He did not write home that night. By December 6th, Division Artillery had compiled enough reports to issue a formal circular. It described the pack howitzer not as a support weapon, but as an assault asset when properly protected by infantry. The language was careful, conservative. It emphasized risk, but it existed. Mercer was promoted to captain on December 18th. The promotion did not change his duties. It changed expectations. At 0750 hours on December 21st, he was ordered to demonstrate the technique for officers from 2 other regiments. The demonstration was conducted against a captured Japanese bunker on the perimeter. The bunker was empty. Mercer insisted on live fire. At 0812 hours, the first round struck. At 0815 hours, the bunker no longer existed. The observers said very little. In January 1944, the Marines shifted focus. Bougainville was contained. Airfields were operational. The campaign moved north and west, but the lesson traveled. On January 22nd, during the invasion of Kwajalein, Army artillery units used 75mm pack howitzers in direct fire against blockhouses. On February 15th, at Anitawick, Marines pushed a pack gun across open sand under fire to destroy a bunker that had survived everything else. The reports began to accumulate. Back in the United States, at Fort Sill, instructors quietly added new case studies to their lectures. They did not change the manuals, not yet. They changed the examples. Mercer left Bougainville in March 1944. He had lost 12 men from his battery. He had gained a reputation he did not seek. He was reassigned as a training officer for artillery units preparing for jungle operations. His job was to teach young lieutenants what the manual did not say. He used a chalkboard. He drew bunkers. He drew angles. He wrote distances in yards, not grid squares. This gun is not weak. It's honest. It does exactly what you ask it to do. You just have to be close enough to ask. Some believed him. Some did not. They would learn later. In July 1944, Mercer was shipped west again, this time toward the Philippines. He carried with him a notebook filled with times, distances, and corrections scribbled in pencil. He had stopped thinking of the pack howitzer as a compromise. He thought of it as a tool that worked when everything else failed. And he knew now exactly how dangerous that knowledge could be.
October 20th, 1944, 0638 hours, Leyte Island, Philippines. Captain Daniel R. Mercer stood on the edge of a flooded rice paddy, boots sunk nearly to the ankle, watching the fog lift off the low ground ahead. The landing at Leyte had begun 2 days earlier, on October 18th. It was the opening move in the return to the Philippines. More than 130,000 troops were already ashore. Naval gunfire had pounded the beaches. Carrier aircraft had flown thousands of sorties. And yet, at 0638 on the 20th, a single Japanese strongpoint still controlled a causeway less than 400 yards long. The strongpoint was a reinforced bunker complex built into a dike. It covered the only dry approach for armored vehicles moving inland. Tanks had tried at dawn. One had taken a direct hit from a concealed 47mm gun and burned for 20 minutes. Infantry had tried next. They were pinned within seconds. At 0641, Mercer received the call. "Artillery's not touching it," the regimental commander said over the radio. "Mortars aren't cracking it. Can you do what you did on Bougainville?" Mercer did not answer immediately. He looked at the terrain, flat, open, no jungle to mask movement. The bunker sat on a slight rise with clear fields of fire. "Distance?" Mercer asked. 300 yards. That was farther than Bougainville, far enough that error mattered. At 0644, Mercer said yes. By 0702, his pack howitzer was moving. The gun crew had practiced this movement dozens of times since March. The gun was broken down, carried across the paddy on shoulder poles, and reassembled behind a low embankment. The men worked without speaking. Each knew his place. At 0719, the first Japanese rounds came in. Small arms fire snapped over the embankment. A machine gun opened from the right flank. Mercer crawled forward with the gunner. "Same approach," he said. "We walk it in." At 0722, the first shell hit short. At 0723, the second struck the dike. At 0724, the third detonated against the bunker face. The Japanese responded immediately. Mortar rounds fell behind the gun. Shrapnel clanged off the shield. At 0726, Mercer adjusted left by 1 mil. The fourth shell entered a firing slit. At 0727, smoke poured out. At 0728, the anti-tank gun fired again. The round passed overhead. Mercer could hear the loader breathing hard. He could smell the powder. At 0729, the fifth shell detonated beneath the bunker's front edge. The structure sagged. At 0730, the bunker collapsed inward. The causeway was open. By 0734, tanks were moving again. The entire engagement had lasted 12 minutes. Later that morning, Mercer walked the position. He counted shell fragments. He examined the bunker remains. The logs were thick, nearly 18 inches in places. The kill came from angles and blast, not penetration. At 11:12, Mercer was ordered to repeat the technique twice more along the Leyte front. Each time, the conditions were different. Each time, the result was the same. By November, the pack howitzer was no longer a curiosity. It was requested. At division headquarters, officers began referring to Mercer-style employment. The phrase made him uncomfortable. He corrected it whenever he heard it. "This isn't a trick. It's math and nerve." In December 1944, Mercer was wounded by shrapnel near Ormoc. A mortar fragment tore into his left shoulder. He was evacuated, then returned to duty 6 weeks later. The war moved on. By early 1945, newer weapons appeared, heavier guns, improved rockets, flamethrowers mounted on tanks. The pack howitzer was still there, still doing its work, but it was no longer alone. Mercer ended the war as a major. He had trained dozens of officers. Some survived, some did not. In August 1945, when the surrender came, Mercer was in Luzon, preparing for an invasion that would never happen. He felt relief, then exhaustion. After the war, Mercer stayed in the service for 2 more years. He attended the Command and General School. He wrote a monograph on artillery employment in restricted terrain. It was dry, precise, full of diagrams. It was quietly circulated. In 1948, he resigned his commission. He returned to Ohio. He married. He worked as a civil engineer. He rarely spoke about Bougainville or Leyte. When asked about the pack howitzer, he said only this: "It worked because we listened to what the ground was telling us." Years later, a restored M1A1 would sit in a museum, its plaque listing weight, caliber, and range. It would not list the time: 9:16, 9:17, 9:18, or the 10 minutes that changed how a toy was understood.
In 1953, the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill issued a revised training circular. It was not dramatic. It did not mention Bougainville by name. It did not cite Captain or Major Daniel R. Mercer. But buried in the section on employment of light artillery was a paragraph that had not existed before. In restricted terrain, light artillery may be employed in direct fire against hardened field fortifications when infantry weapons prove insufficient. Effectiveness depends on range estimation, angle of impact, and coordination with maneuver elements. The language was cautious, institutional, but it was permanent. The M1A1 75mm pack howitzer was already nearing the end of its service life. By Korea, it would be overshadowed by recoilless rifles and newer designs. By Vietnam, it would be a footnote. But its lesson remained. Mobility mattered, accuracy mattered, and sometimes being close mattered more than being big. Mercer never returned to Bougainville. He did visit Fort Sill once in 1961 as a civilian consultant. An instructor recognized his name on a roster and asked him to speak to a class of young lieutenants. Mercer declined at first, then agreed to answer questions. One lieutenant asked why the pack howitzer had worked when larger guns had failed. Mercer thought for a moment. "Because we stopped treating it like artillery," he said, "and started treating it like a rifle that throws 15 pounds of steel." Another asked if it had been worth the risk. Mercer did not answer immediately. He remembered the mortar round on December 3rd, the burial in the rain, the smell of powder and mud. "Yes," he said, "but only when nothing else is left." He left Fort Sill that afternoon and never returned. In the years that followed, historians would write about the Pacific War in terms of fleets and divisions. They would chart island chains and strategic arcs. They would focus on admirals and generals. The pack howitzer would appear rarely, if at all. But among artillerymen, the story persisted. It was told in classrooms, in footnotes, in quiet conversations, about a gun that was called a toy, about a ridge on Bougainville, about 21 rounds in 10 minutes, and about what happens when doctrine meets reality at 180 yards.